March 8, 1945. Cologne was burning. The winter sky hung low and colorless, and the Rhine glimmered like steel through the smoke. Across the ruins, the faint echo of artillery rolled like a tired drumbeat, less a battle now than an ending. Among the shattered walls of an anti-aircraft battery, a dozen young women sat slumped against sandbags, their gray uniforms smeared with ash. They were Flakhelferinnen, auxiliary gunners of the Luftwaffe, trained to load shells and track bombers. Now their battery was silent, its barrels still warm from the last futile shots fired at American planes. They had been told that surrender to the Allies would mean humiliation, perhaps worse. Yet when the first olive drab trucks appeared on the horizon, curiosity outweighed fear. The women squinted through the haze and whispered jokes. One of them, a tall blonde named Lotte, 22, laughed under her breath. "Look at them," she said in German. "Amerikaner, probably soft from Coca-Cola." Another smirked. "They say the Americans don't march, they ride everywhere. Lazy cowboys." The laughter spread, thin and nervous. Mockery was easier than reckoning with defeat. From a distance the Americans did look unreal, figures moving through smoke, their helmets low, rifles slung casual over shoulders. The leading jeep stopped near the battery. A sergeant stepped out, his uniform dusty, his voice calm but firm. "Drop your weapons." His German was rough but clear. The women froze, then obeyed, laying down carbines with reluctant hands. When he gestured toward the road, they rose and filed out, grim, defiant, heads high. The war might be lost, but pride was not surrendered so easily. As they walked, their boots splashed through puddles of melted snow. The road wound between bombed-out farmhouses, where the smell of diesel and burnt hay mixed with damp earth. The American soldiers followed at a distance, silent. The women whispered in German, assuming the men couldn't understand. "They're boys," one murmured. "Look at their faces." "They're nothing compared to ours," another said. But one glance back silenced her. The soldiers behind them weren't boys. Their eyes were old, steady and unafraid. The convoy stopped beside a field where dozens of German prisoners, men this time, waited in lines behind barbed wire. Some wore tattered Wehrmacht uniforms, others civilian coats scavenged from ruins. As the women joined them, they noticed how even the captured German men avoided the gaze of their guards. One of the auxiliaries scoffed. "So, this is what defeat looks like." But when an American corporal passed by, tall, broad-shouldered, carrying a Thompson at ease, the scoff caught in her throat. He nodded politely, not a smirk, not a word. The women exchanged uneasy looks. The contrast was undeniable. The Americans were not what propaganda had promised. Not decadent or weak, not the comic caricatures from Berlin newsreels. These men were clean in their discipline, rugged in their bearing, the sort of strength that didn't need boasting. Their uniforms fit tight across muscle, their steps were measured, almost graceful. And yet, there was no cruelty in their eyes. One soldier, seeing that a woman's hands were trembling from cold, quietly offered his canteen. She hesitated, then took it. Warm water, faintly metallic, but it felt like mercy. As the group was led toward the collection camp, the women's bravado began to wane. They passed a row of American vehicles, jeeps, half-tracks, trucks stacked with rations. Crates marked U.S. Army beans, pork, and chocolate field issue gleamed beneath canvas tarps. The sight was almost surreal. Back in Germany, food had become rumor. One whispered, "They eat chocolate in war." Another answered softly, "That's why they look like that." It was said not in envy, but dawning recognition. The sun broke through the smoke for the first time that day, throwing pale light across the muddy field. The soldiers stood taller in it, silhouettes of calm precision. The women, still in their soot-blackened coats, seemed suddenly small, like actors in a play whose script no longer fit the world outside. They remembered the speeches that had sent them here, the promises of the Reich, the 1,000-year glory, the invincible German man. Yet here, on this road west of Cologne, the world was rewriting itself in front of them. Lotte tried to laugh again but couldn't find the sound. "They're just men," she muttered, as if to herself. But another woman shook her head. "No, they're not like ours. The words lingered between them like smoke refusing to rise. When the trucks came to move them to the rear, the women climbed aboard without resistance. The Americans watched quietly, offering hands to help them up. No jeers, no revenge, only the steady professionalism of soldiers who'd seen too much war to hate anyone left standing. One young GI, barely 20, caught Lotte's eye as she climbed into the truck. His face was streaked with grime, but his gaze was patient, almost gentle. She looked away first. As the convoy rolled out, the city's ruins faded behind them, replaced by open fields and the faint scent of rain. The women sat in silence, their earlier bravado dissolved into the hum of engines. Somewhere far off, church bells rang, a sound almost forgotten. Lotte pressed her hands together, thinking of all the stories she'd believed. About German superiority, about the weakness of others. Yet the image that would not leave her mind was not of tanks or banners, but of a tall, quiet man who didn't need to speak to command respect. For the first time, the certainty that had anchored her since childhood began to tremble. When one of the soldiers in the truck ahead looked back and met her gaze, she realized something she'd never been taught to imagine. That dignity could belong to the other side. And as the convoy turned toward the setting sun, she whispered the words she would never admit aloud. Words that felt heavier than defeat itself. They look stronger than victory. The convoy arrived by afternoon, the light falling soft and pale over the temporary collection camp outside Remagen. Rows of barbed wire stretched along the muddy plain like metal veins through the earth, enclosing hundreds of prisoners, men and women separated by thin fences and the silent rhythm of defeat. The air was thick with the scent of wet wool, diesel, and the smoke of field stoves. Lotte and the other auxiliaries were told to stand in line for registration, their boots sinking into the soaked soil. They no longer spoke much. The jokes that had once filled their march were gone, replaced by the slow realization that the Reich's walls, built from pride, propaganda, and fear, had already fallen, long before the guns did. An American sergeant moved down the line, clipboard in hand. He was a tall man, mid-20s, with the posture of someone who had carried a rifle long enough to forget its weight. His face was unshaven but calm, his eyes steady and unreadable. When he reached Lotte, he gestured for her to remove her gloves and show her hands. She hesitated. "Why?" she asked in halting English. "Checking for powder burns," he said simply. "Standard." She obeyed, palms trembling slightly in the cold. He nodded, marked something on his paper, and moved on. There was no mockery, no anger, only routine. That neutrality unsettled her more than open hostility would have. Nearby, Corporal James Jimmy Warren leaned against a jeep, watching the new arrivals. A farm boy from Iowa, he'd spent 2 years in Europe, from Normandy's beaches to the frozen forests of the Ardennes. He had seen men collapse from exhaustion, seen friends buried in snow and mud, yet his face carried a quiet composure. When he caught the women's eyes, he tipped his helmet in a small gesture of acknowledgement. It wasn't flirtation nor pity, just respect, given as if instinctively. Some of the women looked away, unsure how to meet a gaze that wasn't laced with contempt. The camp itself was a portrait of order within chaos. American soldiers, efficient and methodical, set up medical tents, ration lines, and watch posts with practiced speed. The German prisoners watched in silence as the camp took shape in a matter of hours, an act of discipline that felt more unnerving than any show of power. By evening, the lights from portable generators flickered across the muddy ground, casting long shadows of men in motion. That night, the women were placed in a tent near the perimeter. The canvas walls rippled with wind, and rain dripped steadily from the seams. Lotte lay awake, listening to the muffled hum of English voices outside. Somewhere beyond the fence, a harmonica played softly, its melody slow and tired, yet hauntingly beautiful. It wasn't a victory tune, it sounded like longing, maybe even homesickness. She closed her eyes and wondered if the man playing it missed his mother too. By morning, the rain had stopped. Mist rolled over the camp like a shroud, blurring the fences and the watchtowers, until everything seemed suspended in a gray half-world between war and peace. Breakfast was served. Tins of beans, black coffee, and coarse bread. The Americans distributed the food with quiet efficiency. One young soldier, barely older than Lotte, offered her a cup of coffee. She took it, then nearly coughed at the strength of it. He grinned. "That'll wake you up," he said, and she managed a weak smile. It was the first time in months anyone had spoken to her without a barked order. As the day wore on, Lotte observed the men more closely. There was something unhurried about them, even in their strength, a kind of assurance that needed no performance. Their uniforms were worn but cared for, boots cleaned despite the mud, rifles carried with familiarity rather than tension. In contrast, she thought of the boys she had seen in Berlin, pale, underfed, trembling under Hitler's last speeches. The difference was not just in body, but in spirit. These men had not been promised a 1,000-year empire. They had been told simply to do a job and come home alive. When one of the German women fainted during roll call, Jimmy was among the first to reach her. He lifted her with practiced gentleness, calling for a medic. Lotte watched the scene quietly. The gesture was small, unremarkable, but something inside her shifted. Back home, weakness had been treated with scorn. Compassion was seen as softness. Yet here, strength and mercy coexisted like muscle and bone. Later that afternoon, as the prisoners were assigned work details, cleaning tents, carrying supplies, Lotte found herself face to face with the same sergeant who had inspected her hands. He handed her a shovel. "You can help clear the drainage trench," he said. She stared at the tool, its handle slick with rain. "I'm not built for this," she muttered in German. He caught enough of the tone to understand. "No one is," he replied evenly. "But it keeps the camp dry." There was no mockery, only the dry humor of someone who had long accepted discomfort as normal. By sundown, she was exhausted, her palms raw, her back aching. The Americans worked beside them, saying little, just moving with quiet endurance. When the day ended, one soldier passed around cigarettes. Lotte hesitated again, then took one. She hadn't smoked in years. The taste was harsh, foreign, and strangely grounding. As smoke curled upward, she caught sight of Jimmy again. Shirt sleeves rolled, muscles taut beneath tanned skin, his face lit by the orange glow of the campfire. For a moment, she saw not an enemy, but a man who had carried more than she could imagine. The laughter that rose among the Americans was low and good-natured. Someone told a joke about army food. Another complained about rations. The words meant little to her, but the tone was unmistakable. Comradeship, not bravado. These men didn't need propaganda to feel pride. They carried it quietly, like a heartbeat. That night, as the harmonica played again, Lotte found herself whispering to one of her companions. "Do you think they hate us?" The other woman shook her head. "If they did, we'd know." They both fell silent, listening to the wind tugging at the canvas walls. In that stillness, something unfamiliar settled over them. Not fear, not relief, but a kind of respect born from disillusionment. Across the camp, Jimmy leaned against his jeep, watching the faint glow of the women's tent. He wasn't thinking about victory anymore. He was thinking about how war made strangers stare at one another like mirrors. When his friend beside him muttered, "Hard to believe they were firing at us last week," Jimmy only shrugged. "Yeah," he said softly. "Harder to believe they're just people." The generator lights flickered, the harmonica fell quiet, and the camp sank into uneasy silence. For the first time, the distance between captor and captive felt smaller than the war that had built it. Yet beneath that fragile peace, something deeper stirred, an unspoken question neither side dared to answer. Because tomorrow, word had it, the prisoners would be transferred to a larger camp across the river. And as Lotte stared at the dim outline of the watchtower against the sky, she realized she wasn't afraid of what waited ahead. What frightened her most was how easily respect had replaced hate, and how, in that respect, defeat no longer felt like the end of something, but the beginning of understanding. The next morning, frost silvered the grass outside the tents, and a thin veil of fog hung over the camp like breath from the earth itself. Dawn came quiet, the kind of light that softened everything: the fences, the uniforms, even the faces. Trucks rumbled near the gate, engines coughing, ready for transport to the new holding camp across the Rhine. Lotte stood with the others, her belongings folded neatly in a sack at her feet. She looked different now, less the proud auxiliary, more the woman underneath the uniform. Dirt clung to her boots, but her eyes had cleared of arrogance. She watched as American guards moved between the rows of prisoners, their voices low, gestures precise. There was no rush, no cruelty, only the measured pace of men doing a hard task with quiet dignity. Sergeant Miller, the same man who'd inspected her hands days before, called her group forward. His accent was rough New York, his German still broken but improving. "Line up, ladies," he said. "We move soon." He caught her gaze, then glanced at her bandaged palm, raw from shoveling trenches. "You did good work yesterday," he said simply, then moved on. It wasn't praise in the way she understood it, but something truer, acknowledgement. The small kindness disarmed her more than any victory speech could have. As the convoy began loading, a commotion stirred at the far end of the camp. A young German POW, a boy barely 17, had collapsed near the fence. An American medic rushed over, followed by Miller and a few guards. Lotte, caught by the movement, stepped closer. She saw the boy's thin hands, the hollow beneath his eyes, and realized he was starving. The medic knelt, checked his pulse, and without hesitation, tore open a ration pack. He fed the boy chocolate, spooned water into his mouth, then covered him with his own coat. The gesture was instinctive, not staged. Around them, the prisoners watched in silence, astonishment softening even the bitter ones. When the boy stirred, whispering, "Warum helfen Sie mir?" "Why are you helping me?" the medic only shrugged. "Because we can," he said. The phrase carried through the still air like a sermon. Lotte felt her throat tighten. She had heard her country speak of duty, purity, destiny, but never mercy without reward. That morning, the idea of who the enemy was began to change shape. Hours later, the trucks rolled out. The road followed the river, swollen with spring melt, reflecting the gray sky. The women sat crowded together, wrapped in thin blankets, their breath fogging the cold air. Lotte sat nearest the edge, staring at the American convoy ahead. Jeeps, motorcycles, soldiers silhouetted against the morning light. They looked weary but grounded, their movements efficient, almost ritualistic. It struck her that power didn't need to roar. Sometimes it only needed to endure. At midday, the convoy halted near a small village spared by bombing. The Americans distributed rations, hard biscuits, canned fruit, and coffee. One of them, Jimmy, passed Lotte her tin with a nod. She hesitated, then asked softly, "Why do you share food with us?" He shrugged, chewing. "You're hungry, aren't you?" She managed a small smile. "So are you." He chuckled. "Sure. But we got plenty more." His words carried no malice, just simple truth. She looked down at the peaches floating in syrup, her reflection shimmering between them. Sweetness, after so much bitterness, almost broke her. The convoy resumed. They passed through fields where children waved white cloths at the soldiers, uncertain if they were greeting liberators or conquerors. Lotte's gaze followed a girl no older than 10, standing barefoot by the road with a basket of wilted flowers. The image struck her like an arrow, fragile yet enduring. For a brief moment, she remembered her younger sister, who had joined the League of German Girls, eyes bright with slogans. Would she have waved too, if she'd lived to see this day? By afternoon, clouds gathered heavy and dark. Rain began to fall, not violent, but steady, cleansing. The trucks pressed on until the wheels churned mud. When they finally stopped, the guards ordered everyone to shelter in a nearby barn until the road cleared. Inside, the air smelled of hay and damp wood. The prisoners huddled together on the floor. An American guard lit a lantern, its warm glow cutting through the gloom. Miller entered last, shaking water from his cap. "We'll stay here an hour," he said. "Try to stay warm." In the flicker of light, something softened. The Americans stood along the walls, rifles slung, but their presence no longer carried threat. One took out a harmonica and began to play again, the same tune Lotte had heard on that first night. Its melody wound through the barn like smoke, slow and wistful. The notes spoke of home, of something both sides had lost. The women listened in silence. Jimmy sat nearby, fixing the strap on his rifle. When he noticed Lotte watching, he offered the smallest smile. "You understand music, don't you?" he asked. She nodded. Yes. It doesn't need translation. He gestured toward the harmonica. That's Blue Moon. My mother used to hum it while cooking. Lotte hesitated, then said, My mother hummed Schubert. Before the war. He tilted his head. Guess moms sound the same in any language. The remark, simple and unpolished, hung in the air like something sacred. A gust of wind pushed through the cracks, and the lantern flickered. For a moment, Lotte saw Miller standing near the entrance, staring out at the rain. His silhouette looked carved from stone, yet his shoulders carried the same weight they all bore, the exhaustion of survival. She realized then that none of these men looked triumphant. They looked human. That truth unraveled the last thread of illusion that had bound her. When the rain ceased, the convoy prepared to move again. The prisoners filed out, boots squelching in the mud. Lotte turned once toward the barn, hearing the last faint echo of the harmonica. She didn't know why, but she felt compelled to speak. Sergeant, she called softly. Miller turned. Yes, ma'am. The title, unexpected, courteous, made her pause. Back there, she said, nodding toward the medic who had saved the boy. Thank you. For him. Miller studied her for a moment, then nodded. He's just a kid, he said. War's over for him now. As she climbed into the truck again, the sky cleared, revealing the faint blush of sunset. The clouds burned gold at the edges, and the river shimmered like molten glass. The trucks rolled on, their shadows long on the road. Inside, the women were quiet, not broken, but changed. The laughter of derision that had marked their capture was gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier, and strangely whole. Lotte closed her eyes and thought of how easily illusions die when faced with simple decency. The rhythm of the engine lulled her, the steady growl of a world rebuilding itself. She realized she no longer feared these men, nor despised them. What she feared now was the memory of her own certainty, the blind faith that had once seemed like strength. As the convoy neared the bridge, a beam of light struck the river below, scattering reflections like shards of glass. Lotte watched them shimmer, fleeting but beautiful, and whispered, barely audible even to herself. We were wrong about everything. From the front truck, Jimmy caught sight of her face in the side mirror, tired, yet calm, and wondered what she had just said. He couldn't hear the words, but somehow he understood. Because in war, truth rarely arrives with gunfire. It comes later, softly, like rain after silence. The final camp lay beyond the river, surrounded by fields that once grew wheat and sunflowers before the tanks rolled through. Now the ground was bare, the soil turned and scarred, but the air felt different, less tense, more watchful, like the world was holding its breath. The prisoners were unloaded one truck at a time, their names checked, their possessions recorded. A new order had replaced the chaos of capture, and for the first time, the women realized they were safe. That safety came not from victory, but from the discipline of their captors, the quiet, unwavering kind that didn't need to be proven. Lotte stood in line beneath a sky brushed with early dusk. The fences stretched before her in even lines, silver against the fading light. Beyond them, American soldiers moved with the same calm precision she'd grown to recognize. Each gesture, each word, seemed to contain purpose without cruelty. It unnerved her, the idea that strength could exist without arrogance. She thought of the propaganda reels she'd once believed, the posters of heroic men standing on maps of conquered nations. None of those faces had looked like these soldiers. These men carried no slogans, only silence. When Sergeant Miller approached, clipboard in hand, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, Lotte felt an unexpected warmth, like the familiarity of an old photograph. Name? He asked, not looking up. Lotte Reinhardt, she replied softly. His pencil paused mid-mark. Cologne. She nodded. You were with the flak battery? Yes, she said, eyes lowering. He studied her a moment longer, then simply nodded and wrote her number down. You'll be processed in Barracks D. His tone held no accusation, no triumph, only procedure. And yet, the civility of it stung more than scorn ever could. Inside the barracks, cots lined the walls. The air smelled of disinfectant and rain-soaked wood. A Red Cross worker moved between rows, handing out blankets and small tins of soap. Her voice carried an accent Lotte couldn't place. Swiss, maybe. "You will stay here until repatriation lists are arranged," she said kindly. The women listened, half dazed, half unbelieving. War had made them expect cruelty. Instead, they were being handed order, comfort, and coffee that didn't taste like mud. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. That evening, as the prisoners settled in, Miller and a few soldiers made rounds, checking lanterns and locks. The women watched them, whispering quietly. One of them, a younger girl named Greta, leaned toward Lotte. "They act like we're guests." Lotte shook her head. "No. They act like men." Greta frowned, uncertain what that meant. Lotte didn't explain. She only watched through the slats as the guards outside paced the perimeter, silhouettes sharp against the floodlights. Near midnight, a disturbance broke the stillness, a sudden cry from one of the men's compounds down the hill. Shouts followed, boots striking gravel. The women stirred, peering through gaps in the wood. The alarm lights flared white. For a moment, fear returned like lightning through her chest. Lotte saw figures running, the blur of motion, the metallic echo of gates. Then she recognized Miller among them, his voice cutting through the confusion. "Stand down! Nobody fires." The command was crisp, absolute. Within moments, the noise faded. Later they learned what had happened. A German soldier, delirious from fever, had tried to flee the infirmary, thinking the war still raged. The Americans hadn't shot him. They'd tackled him, wrapped him in blankets, and carried him back to safety. The restraint, the discipline, it struck Lotte harder than gunfire. To win was one thing. To show mercy when victory was certain, that required a strength she had never been taught to admire. Days passed. Spring crept into the camp slowly, softening the edges of winter's ruin. The guards began to smile more easily. The prisoners began to answer. English words mixed with German ones in the air, awkward, halting, but human. One morning, Jimmy appeared by the mess tent with a bucket of paint, whitewashing the fences. Lotte was part of a group assigned to sweep the yard. When he saw her, he grinned. "Didn't expect to see you on work detail." She smirked faintly. "Didn't expect to survive the war." He laughed, the sound carrying across the damp grass. "Guess we both did better than expected." They worked side by side for an hour, painting and sweeping, their conversation stitched together with gestures more than words. She asked about Iowa. He asked about Cologne. Both cities, it turned out, had churches with broken bells. Both had lost too many sons. When a gust of wind lifted the scent of wet paint and pine, Lotte felt something loosen inside her. The invisible knot that had bound her to the old idea of difference. In this simple labor, under a sky too wide for hate, she understood that humanity was not divided by sides but by choices. That afternoon, Miller gathered the women near the gate. "Tomorrow," he announced, "some of you will be transferred to France for repatriation. The rest will remain here until clearance." A murmur rippled through the group, relief, fear, uncertainty. Lotte's name was on the list. She was leaving. The words should have felt like freedom. Instead, they carried the ache of farewell. That night, as she packed her few belongings, the camp was quiet but alive with small sounds. The rattle of canvas, distant murmurs, the hum of generators. Outside, she could see Jimmy and Miller near the jeep, their silhouettes dark against the glow of the floodlight. She hesitated, then stepped outside, her breath misting in the cold. "Sergeant," she called. Miller turned, surprised. "You'll be gone tomorrow," he said, as if confirming it for himself. "Yes," she replied. "To France." He nodded once. "You did well here." She looked at him, searching for something to say that could hold the weight of gratitude, shame, and awe all at once. Words failed her. So she said the only thing that mattered. "You were not what we were told." He smiled faintly. "Neither were you." They stood there for a long moment, the distance between them shrinking not by steps, but by understanding. Before dawn, the trucks lined up again. The camp stirred, lanterns glowing in the fog. The American soldiers moved briskly, calling names, checking manifests. Lotte climbed into the truck, the wooden boards creaking beneath her boots. As engines roared to life, she caught sight of Jimmy standing near the fence, arms crossed, watching. He raised a hand in silent farewell. She hesitated, then mirrored the gesture. The convoy began to move. The fences fell away behind them, swallowed by mist and memory. Lotte looked back until they disappeared completely. In their place rose the faint outline of the sunrise, gold bleeding into gray, soft and endless. For the first time since the war began, she didn't feel pride or shame. Only a strange, humbling peace. She turned to face the road ahead, her reflection caught in the truck's window, tired, older, but freer than she had ever been. And somewhere behind her, in a camp that would soon empty, Sergeant Miller stood at attention as the convoy vanished into the horizon. He did not salute. He simply watched, his expression steady, knowing that in this small corner of a broken world, something far greater than victory had taken place, something neither side could name yet. The engine's hum faded, the sky brightened, and the war that had turned people into enemies ended, quietly, with respect.